In the shadow-draped corridors of medieval power, where whispered secrets carried more weight than gold and betrayal lurked behind every tapestry, there existed a court so steeped in darkness that historians have spent centuries trying to uncover its twisted truths. Welcome to the realm of Queen Ranulf, a monarch whose very name has been deliberately obscured from most historical records, yet whose reign represents one of the most chilling examples of absolute power corrupted absolutely. You think you know medieval history. You've heard the sanitized tales of chivalrous knights and noble queens, the romanticized stories that fill our textbooks and movies. But what you're about to discover will shatter those illusions completely. Queen Ranulf's court wasn't just politically ruthless. It was a carefully orchestrated theater of psychological manipulation, where the most trusted advisors were often the most dangerous enemies, and where the queen herself orchestrated a web of surveillance so sophisticated it would make modern intelligence agencies envious. The year was 1347, and while the rest of Europe grappled with the devastating Black Death, Queen Ranulf saw opportunity in chaos. Her kingdom, strategically positioned between warring nations, had managed to avoid the worst of the plague through methods that were both brilliant and utterly horrifying. But this was just the beginning of her dark legacy. Picture this: a court where every conversation was potentially your last, where the queen's most intimate confidants disappeared without explanation, and where the very architecture of the castle was designed to facilitate espionage and elimination. The throne room itself contained hidden passages that allowed the queen to appear and vanish like a specter, earning her the whispered nickname, the Phantom Crown, among terrified courtiers. What made Queen Ranulf particularly terrifying wasn't just her ruthlessness, it was her intelligence. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to identify their weaknesses, their fears, their secret desires. She would spend months, sometimes years, gathering information about individuals before striking. When she finally moved against someone, it wasn't just their life that ended. It was their entire legacy, their family's reputation, even their name that would be systematically erased from history. The Queen's methods of control went far beyond simple intimidation. She pioneered what we might now recognize as psychological warfare on a personal level. Take Lord Aldrich, her former lover and trusted military commander. When she suspected his loyalty was wavering, she didn't simply have him executed. Instead, she orchestrated an elaborate campaign of mental torture that lasted nearly 2 years. She would have his personal letters intercepted and rewritten, causing him to doubt his own memory. She arranged for his closest friends to repeat conversations back to him with subtle but crucial details changed. She even had his food deliberately prepared inconsistently, sometimes poisoned just enough to cause discomfort, making him paranoid about every meal. By the time Lord Aldrich finally broke, he was convinced he was losing his mind. He begged the Queen for death, which she granted, but only after forcing him to publicly confess to treason he had never committed, thereby justifying her actions and serving as a warning to others. The most chilling part? She documented the entire process in her private journals, treating it like a scientific experiment in human psychology. But Lord Aldrich's fate was merciful compared to what happened to those who truly crossed her. Lady Morgana, the Queen's former best friend and confidant, made the fatal mistake of attempting to organize a subtle resistance movement among the court ladies. When Queen Ranulf discovered this, she devised a punishment so cruel that even hardened executioners refused to carry it out initially. Lady Morgana wasn't simply imprisoned or executed. First, her children were taken and placed in distant monasteries, told their mother had died of plague. Then, her husband was convinced through forged evidence that she had been unfaithful with multiple lovers. Her servants were bribed or threatened into testifying about fictional crimes and moral failures. Her personal possessions were distributed among her enemies, who were instructed to display them prominently. Most horrifically, Queen Ranulf had Lady Morgana's appearance gradually altered through a combination of restricted diet, forced labor, and carefully administered substances that changed her hair color and affected her skin. Over the course of 18 months, Lady Morgana was transformed into someone physically unrecognizable. When she was finally released, her own family didn't recognize her. She spent her remaining years as a beggar in her own former kingdom, occasionally seeing her children from a distance, but never able to convince anyone of her true identity. The genius of Queen Ranulf's cruelty lay in its precision. She understood that the fear of the unknown was far more powerful than any public execution. When courtiers simply vanished, the survivors' imaginations would conjure punishments far worse than reality. This psychological terrorism was incredibly effective at maintaining control, but it also created an atmosphere of such intense paranoia that the court began to cannibalize itself. The Queen actively encouraged this self-destruction. She would plant false evidence of conspiracies, knowing that innocent people would be accused and would then turn on each other in desperation. She created multiple secret societies within her court, each believing they were her only true confidants, then would periodically reveal one group to another, watching as they destroyed each other while she remained safely above the fray. Perhaps most disturbing was her treatment of children. Queen Ranulf understood that controlling the next generation was crucial to maintaining long-term power. She established what she called the Garden of Future Loyalty, a special school for the children of nobles. On the surface, it appeared to be an elite educational institution. In reality, it was a sophisticated indoctrination center where children were systematically turned against their own families. The techniques used were remarkably advanced for the 14th century. Children were rewarded for reporting their parents' private conversations. They were taught to view absolute loyalty to the crown as the highest virtue, superseding family bonds. Most insidiously, they were gradually introduced to increasingly extreme moral compromises, each one justified by the previous one, until they were capable of acts that would have horrified their younger selves. The Queen's network of child informants became one of her most valuable intelligence assets. These children, indoctrinated from a young age, felt genuine love and loyalty toward her while simultaneously being trained to view their own families as potential threats to the realm. When they returned home for visits, they would unconsciously gather information that would later be used to destroy their parents. One particularly tragic case involved young Sir Edmund, son of a minor lord who had expressed private doubts about some of the Queen's policies. Edmund, who had been in the Queen's program for 3 years, overheard his father's concerns and dutifully reported them. The Queen used this information not to immediately arrest the father, but to slowly orchestrate his financial ruin and social isolation. When the father finally committed suicide in despair, Edmund was praised for his loyalty and given his father's lands as a reward. The psychological damage of this betrayal haunted Edmund for the rest of his life. But by then, he was too deeply embedded in the Queen's system to escape. The physical structure of Queen Ranulf's castle reflected her paranoid genius. Every room contained hidden observation points. The walls themselves were honeycombed with secret passages that allowed her network of spies to move unseen throughout the structure. But these weren't simple peepholes or listening posts. The Queen had commissioned artisans to create an elaborate system of mirrors and acoustic amplifiers that could focus sound and sight with remarkable precision. Conversations held in what appeared to be the most private chambers could be monitored from multiple locations. The Queen herself would often spend hours each day moving through these hidden passages, personally observing her courtiers' unguarded moments. She maintained detailed files on every person in her court, noting their habits, their relationships, their fears, and their weaknesses. The dining hall presented particular challenges for surveillance, so the Queen solved this by having the entire floor constructed as a complex mechanism. Individual stones could be lowered slightly, creating tiny gaps that were invisible from above, but allowed sound to travel to listening chambers below. During formal dinners, teams of scribes would record every conversation, which would then be analyzed for signs of disloyalty or useful information. Even more disturbing was the Queen's bedroom, which appeared to be a sanctuary of luxury and privacy. In reality, it was the center of her surveillance network. The ornate ceiling was actually a complex system of one-way mirrors that allowed her to observe the rooms below and adjacent to her chambers. She could watch her most trusted advisors in their private moments, learning their true thoughts and feelings about her policies and person. The Queen's personal guards were perhaps the most psychologically damaged individuals in the entire court. To ensure their absolute loyalty, she employed a selection process that would break down their individual identities completely. Potential guards were taken from their families as children and raised in complete isolation from normal human relationships. They were taught to view the Queen not as a person, but as a divine force whose will was the only reality that mattered. These guards underwent training that was part military preparation, part religious indoctrination, and part psychological conditioning. They were taught to ignore their own physical needs, to feel no emotional attachment to anyone except the Queen, and to carry out any order without question or hesitation. The most successful candidates were those who demonstrated an ability to completely suppress their own moral instincts in favor of absolute obedience. The result was a force of human weapons who were utterly loyal but completely inhuman. They would kill their own siblings if ordered, torture innocent children without showing emotion, and die for the Queen without a moment's hesitation. But this psychological conditioning came at a terrible cost. Most of these guards suffered from what we would now recognize as severe mental illness. They experienced hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and sudden violent episodes that made them dangerous even to their fellow guards. Queen Ranulf's court also became a testing ground for some of the most advanced torture techniques of the medieval period. She wasn't interested in simple physical punishment. She wanted to understand the limits of human psychological endurance. Her dungeons contained cells designed to induce specific types of mental breakdown. Some were constructed to create sensory deprivation, while others provided sensory overload through constant noise, light, or uncomfortable temperatures. Prisoners placed in this room would hear their own voices, recorded earlier through hidden devices, speaking confessions to crimes they had never committed. The acoustic properties of the chamber made it impossible to determine where the sound was coming from, creating the illusion that the words were coming from within their own minds. Many prisoners, after days or weeks in this environment, would begin to believe they had actually committed the crimes they heard themselves confessing to. The Queen documented these experiments meticulously, treating them as scientific research into human nature. Her journals contain detailed observations about how different personality types responded to various forms of psychological pressure. She was particularly interested in the breaking points of people who considered themselves virtuous or morally strong, finding ways to corrupt them that were both efficient and psychologically devastating. Religious figures presented a special challenge, as their faith often provided them with mental resources to resist conventional torture. Queen Ranulf developed specific techniques for undermining religious conviction. She would have prisoners' religious texts subtly altered, changing key passages in ways that would slowly erode their theological certainty. She would arrange for them to witness carefully staged scenes designed to make them question their faith or doubt the existence of divine justice. Most cruelly, she would sometimes arrange for prisoners to believe they were receiving divine visions commanding them to betray their principles. Through a combination of drugs, environmental manipulation, and sophisticated psychological pressure, she could induce religious experiences that felt completely authentic to the victim, but actually served her purposes. The resulting spiritual confusion and self-doubt often proved more effective than any physical torture. The Queen's intelligence network extended far beyond her own court. She maintained agents in neighboring kingdoms, in major trade centers, and even within religious institutions across Europe. These agents weren't simply gathering political or military intelligence. They were collecting detailed psychological profiles of foreign leaders and their advisors. When diplomatic negotiations took place, Queen Ranulf often knew more about her counterparts' personal weaknesses and motivations than they knew about themselves. This intelligence advantage allowed her to manipulate international relations with remarkable skill. She could identify which foreign nobles were vulnerable to bribery, blackmail, or psychological manipulation. She would sometimes spend years cultivating relationships with key figures in other courts, gradually compromising them until they became unwitting agents of her will. One particularly successful operation involved the corruption of Prince Garrett of a neighboring kingdom. Queen Ranulf's agents identified him as intelligent but emotionally insecure, with a desperate need for approval and recognition. Over the course of 2 years, they arranged for him to receive exactly the kind of validation he craved, but always in ways that subtly undermined his loyalty to his own kingdom. The operation began with seemingly innocent cultural exchanges. Queen Ranulf's court would invite Prince Garrett to tournaments and celebrations, where he was treated with elaborate respect and admiration. Beautiful and intelligent women, all secretly in the Queen's service, would seek his company and praise his wisdom and sophistication. Gradually, he began to feel more appreciated in Queen Ranulf's court than in his own home. The psychological manipulation intensified over time. The Queen's agents would arrange for Prince Garrett to overhear carefully crafted conversations that made him question his father's policies and his own kingdom's future. They would present him with intelligence, some real and some fabricated, that suggested his own advisors were incompetent or disloyal. Most effectively, they would create situations where he felt he was making independent decisions that actually served Queen Ranulf's interests. By the time Prince Garrett realized he had been compromised, he was so deeply entangled in the Queen's web that escape seemed impossible. He had already passed crucial military information to her agents, believing he was sharing intelligence with trusted friends. He had agreed to policy positions that weakened his own kingdom's defenses. Most damaging of all, he had been carefully maneuvered into compromising situations that could be used to blackmail him if he ever tried to break free. The transformation of Prince Garrett from a loyal heir to an unwitting traitor took place over such a long period and through such subtle means that he never fully understood what had happened to him. He spent the rest of his life serving Queen Ranulf's interests while believing he was making independent choices for the good of his own kingdom. As Queen Ranulf's psychological empire reached its zenith, the true scope of her surveillance network began to reveal itself through a series of interconnected webs that stretched far beyond her castle walls. The Queen had systematically infiltrated every major trade route between kingdoms, placing her agents as merchants, travelers, and even religious pilgrims. These operatives didn't merely gather information, they actively manipulated the flow of goods, spreading carefully crafted rumors that would destabilize competing territories while strengthening her own position. Her agents operated through a sophisticated system of coded communications hidden within seemingly innocent transactions. A particular arrangement of spices in a merchant's cart conveyed troop movements. The specific coins used in a purchase indicated political allegiances. Even the manner in which bread was displayed at markets served as signals for coordinated psychological operations across multiple kingdoms. This network allowed Queen Ranulf to orchestrate famines, economic collapses, and social unrest in distant lands without ever leaving her throne room. The Queen's most insidious creation was what she termed the doctrine of inherited guilt. This psychological weapon targeted entire bloodlines, ensuring that the sins of parents would be visited upon their children through systematic social ostracism and economic sabotage. Families who had once opposed her found themselves unable to secure marriages for their children, excluded from guilds, and gradually driven into poverty across generations. The beauty of this system lay in its apparent naturalness. Victims believed their misfortunes were due to bad luck or divine punishment, never recognizing the invisible hand orchestrating their downfall. Queen Ranulf's court physicians, working under her direct supervision, conducted what can only be described as medieval psychological experiments on prisoners and political dissidents. They documented how different combinations of isolation, sleep deprivation, and sensory manipulation could break down human resistance. These experiments were meticulously recorded in leather-bound journals that detailed the precise methods needed to drive someone to madness while keeping them physically intact. The Queen viewed these studies as essential research for maintaining power, treating human suffering as mere data points in her grand design. The royal kitchens served as another battlefield in Queen Ranulf's psychological warfare. She employed food as both weapon and tool of control, using subtle poisons that caused gradual cognitive decline rather than immediate death. Certain spices and herbs were administered to specific courtiers to induce paranoia, depression, or violent outbursts. The queen would then use these artificially induced mental states to justify punishments or to manipulate political decisions. She kept detailed charts tracking which substances produced which psychological effects, turning her dining hall into a laboratory of human manipulation. Perhaps most disturbing was Queen Ranulf's systematic corruption of religious institutions within her realm. She planted false prophets and heretical priests who preached doctrines of absolute submission to royal authority. These corrupted religious figures convinced peasants that rebellion against the queen was tantamount to rebellion against divine will. They introduced twisted interpretations of scripture that justified the queen's cruelest acts as necessary for spiritual purification. Churches became centers of psychological conditioning where congregants were taught to report on their neighbors and family members for signs of disloyalty. The queen's manipulation of architecture extended beyond her castle to encompass entire towns and villages. She mandated specific building designs that created optimal conditions for surveillance and psychological pressure. Streets were laid out to funnel crowds toward central squares where public punishments took place, ensuring maximum visibility of her power. Windows were positioned to allow guards to observe private conversations. Even the placement of wells and markets was calculated to force citizens into patterns of movement that facilitated monitoring and control. Queen Ranulf developed an elaborate system for manufacturing false memories in her subjects through a combination of repetitive storytelling, social pressure, and carefully timed rewards and punishments. Courtiers would gradually come to believe alternative versions of events that never actually occurred, making them unreliable witnesses to her crimes while simultaneously turning them into unwitting accomplices. This technique proved particularly effective with children, who could be convinced that their parents had committed acts of treason that existed only in the queen's imagination. The royal treasury served dual purposes under Queen Ranulf's reign. Beyond storing wealth, it housed detailed psychological profiles of every noble family within 100 miles of her borders. These files contained information about personal fears, sexual preferences, family secrets, and psychological vulnerabilities. The queen would study these profiles like a military commander studying battlefield maps, identifying exactly where to apply pressure to achieve maximum psychological impact. She could destroy reputations, break up marriages, or drive enemies to suicide using nothing but carefully deployed information from these files. Queen Ranulf's most ambitious project involved the systematic rewriting of local history to serve her psychological agenda. She commissioned scribes to create false chronicles that portrayed her reign as divinely ordained and historically inevitable. These fabricated histories were then distributed to schools, monasteries, and libraries throughout her territory. Over time, citizens began to internalize these false narratives, genuinely believing that the queen's rule represented natural order rather than tyrannical conquest. She understood that controlling the past was essential to controlling the future. The queen's network of child informants represented perhaps her most morally reprehensible innovation. Children as young as 6 were recruited through a combination of rewards and threats to spy on their own families. These young agents were trained to recognize signs of dissent and to report private conversations to designated handlers. The psychological damage inflicted on these children was immense, as they were forced to choose between family loyalty and survival. Many grew into adults incapable of forming trusting relationships, having learned from childhood that betrayal was not only acceptable but necessary. Queen Ranulf's final and most terrifying achievement was the creation of what she called the Theater of Perpetual Judgment. This was a traveling court that moved throughout her territories, conducting public trials that were elaborate psychological performances designed to terrorize local populations. The outcomes were predetermined, but the proceedings followed careful scripts designed to maximize fear and submission. Witnesses were forced to participate in condemning the accused, making them complicit in the Queen's brutality and less likely to resist future oppression. The Queen's legacy extended far beyond her death through the psychological conditioning of an entire generation. Those who survived her reign carried the trauma and behavioral patterns she had instilled, passing them down to their children and grandchildren. Her methods of control became so deeply embedded in the social fabric that they persisted long after her physical power had ended. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Queen Ranulf's reign was how her methods outlived her mortal existence. When she finally died in 1347, her subjects expected liberation, but Ranulf had engineered something far more sinister than mere political control. She had fundamentally rewired the psychological DNA of an entire civilization. The children raised in her educational camps became the next generation of leaders, carrying forward her techniques of manipulation and surveillance as natural governance. They genuinely believed that trust was weakness, that constant monitoring prevented chaos, and that psychological torture was simply effective administration. What had been Ranulf's deliberate cruelty became their normal. Her network of informants didn't dissolve with her death. These individuals, having spent decades betraying neighbors and family members, found themselves trapped in a web of mutual blackmail and suspicion. They continued operating the surveillance apparatus because stopping would expose their own complicity. The system had become self-perpetuating, feeding on the very paranoia it created. The architectural modifications she mandated remained embedded in every major building. Secret passages, hidden chambers, and observation points became permanent features that subsequent rulers inherited and inevitably used. The infrastructure of oppression had been literally built into the foundations of society. Most disturbing was how her subjects had internalized their oppression. Generations of people emerged who felt naked without being watched, who interpreted privacy as suspicious, and who voluntarily reported their own thoughts to authorities. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that freedom felt like abandonment. The true genius of Queen Ranulf's evil lay not in her personal cruelty, but in creating a system that would continue crushing human dignity long after she was gone. She had achieved the ultimate tyranny, making her victims complicit in their own oppression and eager to inflict it upon others. Her dark legacy proved that the most dangerous monsters are those who convince their victims to become monsters themselves.